The Adventure of Wisteria Lodge. Part 1. The Singular Experience of Mr. John Scott Eccles. I find it recorded in my notebook that it was a bleak and windy day towards the end of March in the end of the year 1892. Holmes had received a telegram whilst we were at our lunch, and he had scribbled a reply. He made no remark, but the matter remained in his thoughts, for he stood in front of the fire afterwards with a thoughtful face, smoking his pipe and casting an occasional glance at the message. Suddenly he turned upon me with a mischievous twinkle in his eyes. "I suppose, Watson, we must look upon you as a man of letters," he said. "How do you define the word grotesque?" "Strange, remarkable," I suggested. He shook his head at my definition. "There's surely something more than that," said he. "Some underlying suggestion of the tragic and the terrible. If you cast your mind back to some of those narratives with which you have afflicted a long-suffering public, you will recognize how often the grotesque has deepened into the criminal. Think of the little affair of the red-headed men. That was grotesque enough in the outset, and yet it ended in a desperate attempt at robbery. Or, again, there was the most grotesque affair of the 5 orange pips, which led straight to a murderous conspiracy. The word puts me on the alert." "Have you it there?" I asked. He read the telegram aloud. "Have just the most incredible and grotesque experience. May I consult you? Scott Eccles, Post Office, Charing Cross." "And a woman?" I asked. "Oh, man, of course. No woman would have ever sent a reply-paid telegram. She would have come. "Will you see him?" "My dear Watson, you know how bored I have been since we locked up Colonel Carruthers. My mind is like a racing engine, tearing itself to pieces because it is not connected up with the work for which it was built. Life is commonplace. This paper is sterile. Audacity and romance seem to have passed forever from the criminal world. Can you ask me, then, whether I am ready to look into any new problem, however trivial it might prove? But here, unless I am mistaken, is our client." A measured step was heard upon the stair, and a moment later a stout, tall, grey-whiskered, and solemnly respectable person was ushered into the room. His life history was written in his heavy features and pompous manner. From his spats to his gold-rimmed spectacles, he was a conservative, a churchman, a good citizen, orthodox and conventional to the last degree. But some amazing experience had disturbed his native composure and left its traces in his bristling hair, his flushed, angry cheeks, and his flurried, excited manner. He plunged instantly into the business. "I've had a most singular and unpleasant experience, Mr. Holmes," said he. "Never in my life have I been placed in such a situation. It is most improper, most outrageous. I must insist upon some explanation." He swelled and puffed in his anger. "Pray sit down, Mr. Scott Eccles," said Holmes in a soothing voice. "May I ask, in the first place, why you came to me at all?" "Well, sir, it is not a matter to be concerned about, and yet, when you have heard the facts, you must admit that I could not leave it where it was. Private detectives are a class with whom I absolutely no sympathy, but nonetheless, having heard your name—" "Quite so, but in the second place, why did you not come at once?" "What do you mean?" Holmes glanced at his watch. "It is 2:15, he said. Your telegram was dispatched about 1, but no one can glance at your toilet and attire without seeing that your disturbance dates from the moment of your waking." Our client smoothed down his unbrushed hair and felt his unshaven chin. "You're right, Mr. Holmes. I never gave a thought to my toilet. I was only too glad to get out of such a house, but I've been running around making inquiries before I came to you. I went to the house agents, and they said that Mr. Garcia's rent was paid up all night and that everything was in the order at Wisteria Lodge.
Come, sir, Holmes said, laughing. You are like my friend Dr. Watson, who has a bad habit of telling his stories wrong end foremost. Please arrange your thoughts and let me know, and their due diligence, exactly what those events are which have sent you out unbrushed and unkept, with dress boots and a waistcoat buttoned awry, in search of advice and assistance.
Our client looked down at the rueful face of his own unconventional appearance. I'm sure it must look very bad, Mr. Holmes, but I am not aware that my whole life such a thing has happened before. But I will tell you the whole queer business, and when I have done so you will admit, I am sure, that there has been enough to excuse me. But his narrative was nipped in the bud. There was a bustle outside, and Mrs. Hudson opened the door to usher two robust and official-looking individuals, one of whom was well known to us as Inspector Gregson of Scotland Yard, an energetic, gallant, and, within his limitations, capable officer. He shook hands with Holmes and introduced his comrade, Inspector Baines, of the Surrey Constabulary. "We are hunting together, Mr. Holmes, and our trail lay in this direction." He turned his bulldog eyes upon our visitor. "Are you Mr. John Scott Eccles of Popham House, Lee?" I am."
"We have been following you around all morning." "You traced him through the telegram, no doubt," said Holmes. "Exactly, Mr. Holmes. We picked up the scent at Charing Cross Post Office and came here."
"But why do you follow me? What do you want?"
"We wish a settlement, Mr. Scott Eccles, as to the events that led to the death last night of Mr. Alonso Garcia of Wisteria Lodge near Esher."
Our client sat up with staring eyes, and every tinge of color struck from his astonished face. Dead? Did you say he was dead?"
"Yes, sir, he is dead."
"But how? An accident?"
"Murder, if there's ever one upon earth."
"Good God, this is awful. You don't mean I am suspected?"
"A letter of yours was found in the dead man's pocket, and we know by it that you had planned to pass last night at his house."
"So I did."
"Oh, you did you?"
Out came the official notebook.
"Wait a bit, Gregson," said Sherlock Holmes. "All you desire is a plain statement, is it not?" "It is my duty to warn Mr. Scott Eccles that it may be used against him." "Mr. Eccles was going to tell us all about it when you entered the room, I think. Watson, a brandy and soda would do him no harm. Now, sir, I suggest that you take no notice of the addition to your audience, and that you proceed with your narrative exactly as you would have done had you never been interrupted."
Our visitor had gulped off the brandy, and the color had returned to his face. With a dubious glance at the inspector's notebook, he plunged at once into his extraordinary statement. "I am a bachelor," said he, "and being of a sociable turn, I cultivate a large number of friends. Among these are the family of a retired brewer named Melville, living in Amberlow Mansion, Kensington. It was at his table that I met some weeks ago a young fellow by Garcia. He was, I understood, of Spanish descent and connected in some way to the embassy. He spoke perfect English, was pleasing in his manners, and good-looking man as I ever saw in my life. In some way we struck up quite a fellowship, this young fellow and I. He seemed to take a fancy to me from the first, and within 2 days of our meeting he came to see me at Lee. One thing led to another, and it ended in his inviting me out to spend a few days at his house, Wisteria Lodge, between Esher and Oxcott. Yesterday evening I went to Esher to fulfill his engagement. He described his household to me before I went there. He lived with a faithful servant, a countryman of his own, who looked after his needs. This fellow could speak English and did his housekeeping for him. Then there was a wonderful cook, he said, a half-breed whom he had picked up in his travels, who could serve an excellent dinner. I remember that he remarked what a queer household it was to find the Hart in Surrey, and that I agreed with him, though it has proved a good deal queerer than I thought. I drove to the place, about 2 miles to the south side of Esher. The house was a fair-sized one, standing back from the road with a curving drive which was banked with high evergreen shrubs. It was an old, tumble-down building in a crazy state of disrepair. When the trap pulled up on the grass-grown drive in the front of the blotched and weather-stained door, I doubt
I had doubts to my wisdom of visiting a man who I knew so slightly. He opened the door himself, however. He greeted me with a great show of cordiality. I was handed over to the manservant, a melancholy, swarthy individual, who led the way, my bag in his hand, to my bedroom. The whole place was depressing. Our dinner was tete-a-tete, and though my host did his best to be entertaining, his thoughts seemed to continually wander, and he talked so vaguely and wildly that I could hardly understand him. He continually drummed his fingers on the table, gnawed his fingernails, and gave other signs of nervous impatience. The dinner itself was neither well served nor well cooked, and the gloomy presence of the taciturn service did not help to enliven us. I can assure you that many times in the course of the evening I wished that I could invent some excuse which would take me back to Lee. One thing comes back to my memory which may have bearing upon the business that you two gentlemen are investigating. I thought nothing of it at the time. Near the end of dinner a note was handed in by the servant. I noticed that after my host had read it he seemed to be more distraught, strange than before. He gave up all pretense in conversation and sat, smoking endless cigarettes, lost in his own thoughts, and he made no remark to the contents. About 11 I was glad to go to bed. Some time later Garcia looked in at my door, the room was dark at the time, and asked me if I had rung. I said that I had not. He apologized for having disrupted me so late, saying that it was nearly 1 o'clock. I dropped off after this and slept soundly all night. And now I come to the amazing part of my tale. When I woke, it was broad daylight. I glanced at my watch. The time was nearly 9. I had particularly asked to be called at 8, so I was very much astonished at this forgetfulness. I sprang up and rang for the servants. There was no response. I rang again and again with the same result. Then I came to the conclusion that the bell was out of order. I huddled on my clothes and hurried downstairs in an exceedingly bad temper to order some hot water. You can imagine my surprise when I found that there was no one there. I shouted in the hall, and there was no answer. Then I ran from room to room. All were deserted. My host had shown me which was his bedroom the night before, so I knocked at the door. No reply. I turned the handle and walked in. The room was empty, and the bed had never been slept in. He had gone with the rest. The foreign host, the foreign footman, the foreign cook had all vanished in the night. That was the end of my visit to Wisteria Lodge. Sherlock Holmes was rubbing his hands and chuckling as he added to this bizarre incident to his collection of strange episodes. Your experience is, so far as I know, perfectly unique, said he. May I ask, sir, what you did then? Oh, I was furious. My first idea was that I had been the victim of some absurd practical joke. I packed my things, banged the hall door behind me, and set off for Esher, with my bag in my hand. I called at Allen Brothers, the chief land agents of the village, and found that it had been from this firm that the villa had been rented. It struck me that the whole proceeding could hardly be for the purpose of making a fool of me, and that the main object must be to get out of rent. It was late in March, so quarter day is at hand. But this theory would not work. The agent was obliged to me for my waiting and told me that the rent had been paid in advance. Then I made my way to town and called at the Spanish embassy. The man was unknown there. After this I went to Melville, at whose house I had first met Garcia, but I found that he really knew rather less about him than I did. Finally, when I got your reply by my wire, I came out to you, since I understand that you are a person who gives advice on difficult cases. But now, Mr. Inspector, I gather from what you said when you entered my room that you can carry on the story and that some tragedy has occurred. I can assure you that every word I have said is truth, and that outside of what I have told you, I know absolutely nothing about the fate of this man. My only desire is to help the law in every possible way. I'm sure it is, Mr. Scott Eccles, I'm sure of it, said Inspector Gregson in a very amiable tone. I am bound to say that everything which you have said agrees very closely with the facts that we have come to our notice. For example, there was that note which arrived during dinner. Did you chance and observe what became of it? Yes, I did. Garcia rolled it up and threw it in the fire. What do you say of that, Mr. Baines? The counter-detective was a stout, puffy red man whose face was only redeemed from grossness by two extraordinarily bright eyes, almost hidden behind the heavy creases of cheek and brow. With a slow smile, he drew a folded and discolored scrap of paper out of his pocket. It was a dog grate, Mr. Holmes, and he overpitched it. I picked it out unburned from the back of it. Holmes smiled his appreciation. He must have examined the house very carefully to find a single pellet of paper. I did, Mrs. Holmes. It's my way. Shall I read it, Mr. Gregson? The Londoner nodded. The note is written upon ordinary cream-laid paper with the watermark. It's a quarter sheet. The paper is cut in 2 strips with short-bladed scissors. It has been folded over 3 times and sealed with purple wax, put on hurriedly, and pressed down with some flat oval object. It is addressed to Mr. Garcia, Wisteria Lodge. It says, our own colors, green and white, green open, white shut. Main stair, first quarter, 7th right, green baize. Godspeed, D. It's a woman's writing, done with a sharp-pointed pen, but the address is neither done with another pen or by someone else. It is thicker and broader, as you see. A very remarkable note, said Holmes, glancing it over. I must compliment you, Mr. Barnes. Your attention to detail in your examination of it. A few trifling points might perhaps be added. The oval seal is undoubtedly plain sleeve ink. What else would be such a shape? The scissors are bent nail scissors. 2 of the snips are, you can see distinctly, have the same slight curve to each. The country detective chuckled. I thought I'd squeezed all the juice out of it, but I see there was a little left over, he said. I'm bound to say that I make nothing but the note except that there was something on hand, and that a woman, as usual, was at the bottom of it. Mr. Scott Eccles had fidgeted in his seat during this conversation. I'm glad you found the note, since it corroborates my story, said he, but I beg to point out that I have not heard what has happened to Mr. Garcia, nor what has become of his household. As to Garcia, said Gregson, that is easily answered. He was found dead this morning at Oxot Common, nearly a mile from his home. His head had been smashed to a pulp by heavy blows of a sandbag or some such instrument, which had crushed rather than wounded. It's a lonely corner, and there's no house within a quarter of a mile of the spot. He had apparently been struck first from behind, but his assailant had gone on beating him long after he was dead. It was a most ferocious assault. There were no footsteps nor any clue in the criminals. Robbed? No, there was no attempt at robbery. This is very painful and terrible, said Mr. Scott Eccles in a querulous voice. But is it really uncommonly hard upon me? I had nothing to do with my host going off in the nocturnal excursion and meeting so sad an end. How do I come to be mixed up in this case? Very simply, sir, Inspector Barnes answered. Not only was the document found in the pocket of the deceased was a letter from you saying that you would be with him on the night of his death, it was an envelope of this letter which gave the dead man's name and address. It was after 9 this morning when we reached the house, and neither you nor anyone else inside it. I wired Mr. Gregson to run you down to London while I examined Wisteria Lodge. When I came into town, we joined Mr. Gregson, and here we are. I think now, said Gregson, rising, we had best put the matter into an official shape. You will come round with us to the station, Mr. Scott Eccles, and let us have your statement in writing. Certainly, I will come at once, but I retain your services, Mr. Holmes. I desire you to spare no expense and no pains to get at the truth. My friend turns to the county inspector. I suppose that you have no objection to my collaborating with you, Mr. Baines? Highly honored, sir. I'm sure I am. You appear to have both very prompt and businesslike in all that you have done. Was there any clue, may I ask, as to the exact hour that this man met his death? It had been there since 1 o'clock. There was rain about it at that time, and his death was certainly before the rain. But that is perfectly impossible, Mr. Baines, cried our client. His voice is unmistakable. I could swear that it was he who addressed me in my bedroom at that very hour. Remarkable, but by no means impossible, said Holmes, smiling. You have a clue? Asked Gregson. On the face of it, this case is not a very complex one, though it certainly presents some novel and interesting features. A further knowledge of facts is necessary before I would venture to give my final and definite opinion. By the way, Mr. Barnes, did you find anything remarkable besides a note in your examination of the house?
The detective looked at my friend in a singular way.
There were, he said, one or two very remarkable things. Perhaps when I have finished the police station you would care to come out and give me your opinion of them. I am entirely at your service, said Holmes, ringing the bell. You will show these gentlemen out, Mrs. Hudson, and kindly send a boy with this telegram. He is to pay a 5-shilling reply.
We sat for some time in silence after our visitors had left. Holmes smoked hard, and with his brows drawn down over his keen eyes, and his head thrust forward in an eager way characteristic of the man.
Well, Watson, he asked, turning suddenly upon me, what do you make of it?
I can make nothing of this mystification of Scott Eccles.
But the crime?
Well, taken with the disappearance of the man's companions, I should say that they were in some way concerned in the murder and had fled from justice.
That is certainly a possible point of view. On the face of it, you must admit, however, that it is very strange that his 2 servants should have been in a conspiracy against him, and should have attacked him on the one night when he had a guest. They had him alone at their mercy every other night in the week.
And then, why did they fly?
Quite so. Why did they fly? There is a big fact, another big fact in the remarkable experience of our client Scott Eccles. Now, my dear Watson, it is beyond the limits of human ingenuity to furnish an explanation which would cover both these big facts. If it were one which would also admit the mysterious note with its very curious phraseology, why, then it would be worth accepting as a temporary hypothesis. If the fresh facts which come to our knowledge all fit themselves into the scheme, then our hypothesis may gradually become a solution.
But what is a hypothesis? Holmes leaned back in his chair with his half-closed eyes.
You must admit, my dear Watson, that the idea of a joke is impossible. There were grave events afoot, as the sequel showed, and the coaxing of Scott Eccles to Wisteria Lodge had some connection with them.
But what possible connection?
Let us take it link by link. There is, on the face of it, something unnatural about the strange and sudden friendship between the young Spaniard and Scott Eccles. It was a former one who forced the place. He called upon Eccles at the other end of London on the very day after he met him, and he kept in close touch with him until he got down to Esher. Now, what did he want with Eccles? What could Eccles supply? I see no charm in the man. He is not particularly intelligent, not a man likely to be congenial with the quick-witted Latin. Why, then, was he picked out from all the other people whom Garcia met as particularly suited to his purpose? Has he one outstanding quality? I say that he has. He is the very type of conventional British respectability, and the very man as a witness to impress another Briton. You saw yourself how neither of the inspectors dreamed of questioning his statement, extraordinary as it was.
But what was he to witness?
Nothing, as things turned out, but everything had they gone another way. That is how I read the matter.
I see. He might have proved an alibi.
Exactly, my dear Watson. He might have proved an alibi. We will suppose, for argument's sake, that the household of Wisteria Lodge are confederates in some design. The attempt, whatever it may be, is to come off, we shall say, before 1 o'clock. But by juggling the clocks, it is quite possible that they have got Scott Eccles in bed earlier than he thought. But in any case, it is likely that when Garcia went out of his way to tell him that it was 1, it really was not more than 12. If Garcia could do whatever he had to do, and be back an hour mentioned, had evidently the powerful reply of any accusation. Here was this irreproachable Englishman, ready to swear in any court of law that the accused was in his house all the time. It was an insurance against the worst.
Yes, I see that. But how about the disappearance of the others?
I have not all the facts yet, but I do not think there are any insuperable difficulties. Still, it is an error to argue in front of your data. You find yourself insensibly twisting them around to fit your theories.
And the message?
How did it run? Our own colors, green and white. Sounds like racing. Green opened, white shut. That is clearly a signal. Main stair, first corridor, 7th right, green biaise. This is an assignation. We may find a jealous husband at the bottom of it all. It was clearly a dangerous quest. She would not have said Godspeed had it not been so. D, that should be the guide. The man was a Spaniard. I suggest that D stands for Dolores, a common female name in Spain. Good, Watson. Very good. But quite inadmissible. A Spaniard would write in Spanish. The writer of this note was clearly English. Well, we can possess our souls in patience until this excellent inspector comes back for us. Meanwhile, we can thank our lucky fate, which has rescued us in a few short hours from this insufferable fatigues of idleness.
An answer had arrived at Holmes's telegram before our Surrey officer had returned. Holmes read it, and it was about to place it in his notebook when we caught a glimpse of my expectant face. He tossed it across with a laugh.
"We're moving in exalted circles," said he.
The telegram was a list of names and addresses. Lord Herringby, the Dingle, Sir George Fowent, Oxford Towers, Mr. Hines, J.P., Purdley Place, Mr. James Baker Williams, Fortin Oldhall, Mr. Henderson, High Gable, and Reverend Joshua Stone, Nether Walsley.
"This is a very obvious way of limiting our field of operations,"
said Holmes.
No doubt Baines, with his methodical mind, has already adopted a similar plan.
I don't quite understand.
Well, my dear fellow, we have already arrived at the conclusion that the message received by Garcia at dinner was an appointment or an assignation. Now, if the obvious reading of it is correct, and the order to keep his trysts one to ascend the main stair and seek a 7th floor in a corridor, it is perfectly clear that the house is a very large one. It is equally certain that this house cannot be more than a mile or two from Oxshott, since Garcia was walking in that direction, and hoped, according to my reading of the facts, to be back at Wisteria Lodge in time to avail himself of an alibi, which would only be valid up to 1 o'clock. As the number of lodge houses close to Oxshott must be limited, I adopted an obvious method of sending the agents mentioned by Scott's Eccles and obtaining a list of them. Here they are in this telegram, and the other end of our tangled skein must lie among them.
It was nearly 6 o'clock before we found ourselves in the pretty Surrey village of Esher, with Inspector Baines as our companion. Holmes and I had taken things for the night, and found comfortable quarters at the Bull. Finally, we set out in the company of our detective on our visit to Wisteria Lodge. It was a cold, dark March evening, with a sharp wind and a fine rain beating us on our faces. A fit setting for a wild common over which our road passed, and the tragic goal to which it led us. Part 2. The Tiger of San Pedro. A cold and melancholy walk of a couple miles brought us to the high wooden gate, which opened into a gloomy avenue of chestnuts. The curved and shadowed drive led us to a low, dark house, pitch black against the slate-colored sky. From the front window upon the left of the door there peeped a glimmer of feeble light.
"The constable in the possession,"
said Barnes.
"I'll knock at the window."
He stepped across the glass pot, and tapped with his hand on the pane. Through the fogged glass, I dimly saw a man spring up from a chair beside the fire, and heard a sharp cry from within the room. An instant later, a white-faced, hard-breathing policeman had opened the door, a candle waving in his trembling hand.
"What's the matter, Walters?"
asked Baines sharply. The man mopped his forehead with a handkerchief, and gave a long sigh of relief.
"I'm glad you've come, sir. It's been a long evening, and I didn't think my nerve as good as it was." "Your nerve what, Walters? I should have thought you had a nerve in your body." "Oh, sir, this is a lonely, silent house, and a queer thing in the kitchen. When you tapped at the window, I thought it had come again."
"What had come again?"
"The devil, sir, for all I know. It was at the window."
"What was at the window, and when?"
It was about an hour, 2 hours ago. The light was just fading, and I was sitting reading in the chair. I don't know what to make of it to look up, but there was a face looking at me through the lower pane. Lord, sir, what a face it was! I only see it in my dreams.
Tut, tut, Waters. This is not the talk of a police constable.
I know, sir, I know, but it shook me, sir, and there's no use to deny it. It wasn't black, sir, nor was it white, nor any other color that I know of, but a kind of queer shade of like clay with a splash of milk in it. And there it was, the size of it was twice yours, sir, and by look of it the great staring Google eyes and the line of white teeth like a hungry beast. I tell you, sir, I couldn't move a finger, nor get my breath till it whisked away and was gone. I ran out and through the shrubbery, but thank God there was no one there. If I didn't know you were a good man, Walters, I should think the black mark against you for this. If it were the devil himself, a constable on duty should never thank God that he should not lay his hands upon him. I suppose the whole thing is not a vision and a touch of nerves. That, at least, is very easily settled, said Holmes, lighting his little pocket lantern. Yes, he reported after a short examination of the grass bed. A number 12 shoe, I should say. If he was at all the same scale as his foot, he must certainly have been a giant. What became of him? He seems to have broken through the shrubbery and made for the road. Well, said the inspector with a grave and thoughtful face, whoever he may be, and whatever he may have wanted, he's gone for the present, and we have more immediate things to attend to. Now, Mr. Holmes, with your permission, I will show you round the house. The various rooms and sitting rooms had yielded nothing to the careful search. Apparently the tenants had brought little or nothing with them, and all the furniture down to the smallest detail had been taken over with the house. A good deal of clothing with a stamp of Marks & Co. A high Holborn had been left behind. Telegraphic inquiries had been already made, which showed that Marks knew nothing of his customer save that he was a good pair. Odds and ends, some pipes, a few novels, two of them in Spanish, and an old-fashioned pinfire revolver, with a guitar amongst the things of a person's property. Nothing in all this, said Baines, stalking, a candle in hand from room to room. But now, Mr. Holmes, I invite your attention to the kitchen. There was a gloomy, high-ceilinged room at the back of the house, with a straw litter in one corner, which served apparently as a bed for the cook. The table was piled with half-eaten dishes and dirty plates, the debris of last night's dinner. Look at this, said Baines. What do you make of it? He held up his candle before an extraordinary object which stood at the back of the dresser. It was so wrinkled and shrunken and withered that it was difficult to say that it might have been. One could say that it was black and leathery, and that it bore some resemblance to a dwarfish human figure. At first, as I examined, I thought it was a mummified Negro baby, and then it seemed a very twisted and ancient monkey. Finally, I was left in doubt as to whether it was animal or human. A double band of white shells was strung around the center of it. Very interesting indeed, said Holmes, peering at the sinister relic. Anything more? In silence, Baines led the way to the sink and held forward a candle. The limbs and body of some large white bird, torn savagely to pieces with the feathers still on, were littered all over it. Holmes pointed at the wattles and the severed head. A white cock, he said. Very interesting. It is really a very curious case. In silence, Baines led the way to the sink and held forward his candle. The limbs and... But Mr. Baines had kept his most sinister exhibit to the last. Under the sink he drew a zinc pail which contained a quantity of blood. Then from the table he took a platter and heaped with small pieces of charred bone. Something has been killed, and something has been burned. We raked all these out to the fire. We had a doctor this morning, and he says they are not human. Holmes smiled and rubbed his hands. I must congratulate you, Inspector, on handling so distinctive and instructive a case. Your powers, if I may say so without offense, seem superior to your opportunities.
Inspector Baines' small eyes twinkled with pleasure.
You're right, Mr. Holmes. We stagnate in the provinces, and a case of this sort gives a man a chance, and I hope that I shall take it. What do you make of these bones? A lamb, I should say, or a kid.
And the white cock?
Curious, Mr. Baines. Very curious. I should say almost unique. Yes, sir, there must have been some very strange people with some very strange ways in this house. One of them is dead. Did his companions follow him and kill him? Did they? If they did, we should have them, for every port is watched. But my own views are different. Yes, sir, my very own views are very different. You have a theory, then? And I'll work it myself, Mr. Holmes. It's only due to my own credit to do so. Your name is made, and I have still to make mine. I should be glad to be able to say afterwards that I have solved it without your help.
Holmes laughed good-humouredly.
Very well, Inspector, said he. Do you follow your path, and I will follow mine. My results are always as much at your service as if you care to apply to me for them. I think that I have seen all that I wish in this house, and that my time may be more profitable employed elsewhere. Au revoir, and good luck.
I could tell by numerous subtle signs, which might have been lost upon anyone but myself, that Holmes was on the hot scent. As impassive as ever to the casual observer, there were none the less of subdued eagerness and suggestion of tension in his brightened eyes and brisker manner, which assured me that the game was afoot. After his habit he said nothing, and after mine I asked no questions. Sufficient for me to share in the sport and lend my humble help to capture without distracting the intent brain with needless interruption. All would come round to me in due time. I waited, therefore, but to my ever-deepening disappointment I waited in vain. Day succeeded day, and my friend took no step forward. One morning he spent in town, and I learned from a casual reference that he had visited the British Museum. Save for this one excursion, he spent his days in long and evening solitary walks, or in chatting with a number of village gossips whose acquaintances he had cultivated.
I'm sure, Watson, a week in the country will be invaluable to you, he remarked. It is very pleasant to see the first green shoots upon the hedges and the catskins on the hazels once again. With a spud, a tin box, and an elementary book of botany, there are instructive ways to be spent.
He prowled about with this equipment himself, but it was a poor show of plans which he would bring back in the evening. Occasionally in our rambles we came across Inspector Baines. His fat red face wreathed itself in smiles, and his small eyes glittered as he greeted my companion. He said little about the case, but from what that little we gathered that he was also not dissatisfied with the course of events. I must admit, however, that I was somewhat surprised when, 5 days later after the crime, I opened my morning paper to find the large letters. The Oxshot Mystery, a solution, arrest of supposed assassin. Holmes sprang in his chair as if he had been stung when I read the headlines.
By Jove, he cried. You don't mean that Barnes has got him?
Apparently, I said, as I read the following report. Great excitement was caused at Esher and the neighbouring district when it was learned late last night that the arrest had been effected in connection with the Oxshot murder. It will be remembered that Mr. Garcia of Wisteria Lane was found dead in Oxford Common, his body showing signs of extreme violence, and that on the same night his servant and his cook fled, which appeared to show their participation in the crime. It was suggested, but never proved, that the deceased gentleman may have had valuables in the house, and that their abstraction was his motive of the crime. Every effort was made by Inspector Baines, who has the case in hand, to ascertain the hiding places of the fugitives. And he had good reason to believe that they had not gone far, but were lurking in some retreat which had been already prepared. It was certain from the first, however, that they would eventually be detected, as the cook, from the evidence of one or two townspeople who have caught a glimpse of him through the window, was a man of most remarkable appearance, being a huge, monstrous mulatto, with yellowish features and a pronounced negroid type. This man was seen at the scene of the crime, for he was detected and pursued by Constable Walters on the same evening. And when he had audacity to revisit Wisteria Lodge, Inspector Baines considered that such a visit might have some purpose in view, and was likely, therefore, to be repeated. Abandoned the house and left an ambuscade in the shrubbery. The man walked into a trap and was captured last night after a struggle, in which Constable Downing was badly bitten by the savage. We understand that when the prisoner is brought before the magistrates, a reprimand will be applied for by the police, and the great developments are hoped from his capture.
Really, we must see Baines at once, cried Holmes, picking up his hat. We will just catch him before he starts.
They hurried down the village street and found, as we expected, that the inspector was just leaving his lodgings.
You've seen the paper, Mr. Holmes? He asked, holding one out to us. Yes, Baines, I've seen it. Pray don't take it at liberty if I give you a word of friendly warning. A warning, Mr. Holmes? I've looked into the case with some care, and I am not convinced that you are on the right lines. I don't want you to commit yourself too far, unless you are sure.
You're very kind, Mr. Holmes.
I assure you, I speak for your good.
It seemed to me that something like a wink quivered an instant over me from Mr. Barnes's tiny eyes.
We agreed to work on our own lines, Mr. Holmes. That's what I'm doing. Oh, very good, said Holmes. Don't blame me. Yes, I believe you mean well by me, but we all have our own systems, Mr. Holmes. You have yours, and maybe I have mine. Let us say no more about it. You're welcome always to my news. This fellow is a perfect savage, as strong as a quiet horse, and as fierce as the devil. He chewed Downing's thumb down nearly before he could master him. He hardly speaks a word of English, and we can get nothing out of him but grunts. And you think you have the evidence that he murdered his late master? I didn't say so, Mr. Holmes. I didn't say so. We have all our little ways. You try yours, and I will try mine. That's the agreement.
Holmes shrugged his shoulders as they walked away together.
I can't make that man out. He seems to be riding for a fall. Well, as he says, we must each try our own way and see what comes of it. But there's something in Inspector Baines's which I can't quite understand. Just sit down in the chair, Watson,
said Sherlock Holmes, when we had returned to our apartment at the Bull.
I wanted to put you in touch with the situation, as I may need your help tonight. Let me show you the evolution of this case, so far as I have been able to follow it. Simple as it has been in its leading features, it has nonetheless presented surprising difficulties in the way of an arrest. There are gaps in that direction which we have still to fill. We will go back to the note which was handed in to Garcia upon the evening of his death. We may put aside the idea of Baines's that Garcia's servants are concerned with the matter. The proof of this lies in the fact that he was also arranged in the presence of Scott Eccles, which could only have been done for the purpose of an alibi. It was Garcia, then, who had the enterprise, and apparently a criminal enterprise, in hand that night, in the course of which he met his death. I say criminal because only a man with a criminal enterprise desires to establish an alibi. Who, then, is likely to have taken his life? Surely the person against whom the criminal enterprise was directed. So far as it seems to me that we are on safe ground. We can now see a reason for the disappearance of Garcia's household. They were all confederates in the same unknown crime. If it came off, then Garcia returned, any possible suspicion would be warded off by the Englishman's evidence, and all would be well. But the attempt was a dangerous one, and Garcia did not return by a certain hour. It was probable that his own life had been sacrificed. It had been arranged, therefore, that in such a case his two subordinates were to make for some prearranged spot, where they could escape investigation, and be in a forward position afterwards to renew their attempt. That would fully explain the facts, would it not?
The whole inexplicable tangle seemed to straighten out before me. I wondered, as I always did before, how it had not been so obvious to me before. But why should one servant return?
We can imagine that, in the confusion of flight, something precious, something which he could not bear to part with, had been left behind. That would explain his presence, would it not?
Well, what is the next step?
The next step is a note received by Garcia at dinner. It indicates a Confederate at the other end. Now, where was the other end? I have already shown you that it would only be lying in one of the large houses, and that the number of large houses is limited. My first days in the village were devoted to a series of walks, in which the intervals of the botanical researches I made a reconnaissance of all the large houses and examination of the family history of the occupants. One house, only one, riveted my attention. It is the famous old Jacobean Grange of High Gable, 1 mile from the farther side of Oxshott, and less than half a mile from the scene of the tragedy. The other mansions belong to prosaic and respectable people who live far aloof from romance. But Mr. Henderson of High Gable was by all accounts a curious man, to whom curious adventures might befall. I concentrated my attention, therefore, upon him and his household. A singular set of people, Watson. The man himself, the most singular of all. I managed to see him on a plausible pretext, and I seemed to read in his dark, deep-set, brooding eyes that he was perfectly aware of my true business. He is a man of 50, strong, active, with iron grey hair and great bunched black eyebrows, the step of a deer and the air of an emperor. A fierce, masterful man with a red-hot spirit behind his parchment face. He is either a foreigner or has lived long in the tropics, for he is yellow and sapless, as tough as a whipcord. His friend and secretary, Mr. Lucas, is undoubtedly a foreigner, chocolate-brown, wily, suave, cat-like, with a poisonous gentleness in speech. You see, Watson, we have come already down to 2 sets of foreigners, one at Wisteria Lodge, one at High Gable, so our gaps are beginning to close. These 2 men, close and confidential friends, are the center of the household, but there is one other person who for immediate purpose, may be the most important. Henderson has 2 children, girls of 11 and 13. Their governess is a Miss Bennet, an Englishwoman of 40 or thereabouts. There is also one confidential manservant. This little group forms a real family, for they travel about together, and Henderson is a great traveler, always on the move. It is only within the last few weeks that he has returned after a year's absence to High Gable. I may add that he is enormously rich, and whatever his whims may carry, he is very easily to satisfy them. As for the rest, his house is full of butlers, footmen, maidservants, and the usual overfed, underworked staff of a large English country house. So much I learned partly from the village gossip and partly from my own observation. There are no better instruments than discharged servants with a grievance, and I was lucky enough to find one. I call it luck, but it would not have come my way if I had not been looking out for it. As Baines remarks, we have our systems. It was my system which enabled me to find John Warner, the late gardener of High Gable, sacked in the moment of temper by his impervious employer. He in turn had friends among the poor indoor servants, who unite in the fear and dislike of their master. So I had my key to the secrets of the establishment. Curious people, Watson. I don't pretend to understand it all yet, but very curious people anyway. It's a double-winged house, and the servants live on one side and the family on the other. There's no link between the two save for Henderson's own servant, who serves in the family's meals. Everything is carried to a certain door which forms the one connection. Governess and children hardly go out at all, except into the garden. Henderson never by any chance walks alone. His dark secretary is like his shadow. The gossip among servants is that their master is terribly afraid of something. Sold his soul to the devil in exchange for money, says Warner, and expects his creditor to come up and claim his own. Where they came from, or who they are, nobody has any idea. They are very violent. Twice Henderson has lashed out at folk with his dog whip, and only his long purse and heavy compensation have kept him out of the courts. Well now, Watson, let us judge the situation by this new information. We may take it that the letter came from his strange household, as was an invitation to Garcia to carry out some attempts which had already been planned. Who wrote the note? It was someone within the citadel, or was it a woman? Who then but Miss Bennet, the governess? All our reasoning seems to point that way. At any rate, we may take it to a hypothesis to see what consequences it would entail. I may add that Miss Burnet's age and character make it certain that my first idea that there might have been a love interest in our story is out of the question. If she wrote the note, she is presumably a friend and confederate to Garcia. What, then, might she have been expected to have heard of his death? If he meant it with some nefarious enterprise, her lips might be sealed. Still, in her heart she must retain bitterness and hatred against those who had killed him, and would presumably help so far as she could to have her revenge upon them. Could we see her, then, and try to use her? That was my first thought. But now we come to the sinister fact. Miss Burnett has not been seen by any human eye since the night of the murder. From that evening she has utterly vanished. Is she alive? Has she perhaps met her end at the same night as the fiend who had been summoned? Or is she merely a prisoner? There's the point which we still have to decide. You'll appreciate the difficulty of the situation, Watson. There's nothing upon which we can apply for a warrant. Our whole scheme might seem fantastic if laid to a magistrate. The woman's disappearance counts for nothing, since in that extraordinary household any member of it might be invisible for a week. And yet she may be at the present moment in danger for her life. All I can do is watch the house and leave my agent Warner on guard at the gates. We can't let such a situation continue. If the law can do nothing, we must take the risk ourselves.
What do you suggest?
I know which is her room. It is accessible at the top of an outhouse. My suggestion is that you and I go tonight to see if we can strike at the very heart of the mystery.
It was not, I must confess, a very alluring prospect. The old house with the atmosphere of murder, the singular and formidable inhabitants, and the unknown dangers of the approach, and the fact that we were putting ourselves legally in a false position, all combined to dampen my ardor. But there was something in this ice-cold reasoning of Holmes which made it impossible to shrink from any adventure which he might recommend. One knew that thus, and only thus, could find a solution be found. I clasped his hand in silence, and the die was cast. But it was not destined that our investigation should have an adventurous ending. It was about 5 o'clock, and the shadows of March evening were beginning to fall, when an excited rustic rushed into our room.
"I've gone, Holmes. They went last night by train. The lady broke away, and I got her cab downstairs."
"Excellent, Warner," cried Holmes, springing to his feet. "Watson, the gaps are closing rapidly." The cab was a woman, half collapsed from a nervous exhaustion. She bore upon her aquiline and emaciated face traces of some recent tragedy. Her head hung listlessly upon her breast, but as she raised and turned her dull eyes upon us, I saw that her pupils were dark dots in the center of her broad gray iris. She was drugged with opium.
"I watched at the gate, same as you advised, Mr. Holmes,"
said our emissary, the discharge gardener.
"When the carriage came out, I followed it to the station. She was like one walking in her sleep, but when I tried to get her to the train, she came back to life and struggled. They pushed her into the carriage. She fought her way out. I took her apart and got her in the cab. And here we are. I shan't forget the face of the carriage window as I led her away. Of a short life if he had his way, the black-eyed, scowling yellow devil."
We carried her upstairs, laid her upon the sofa, and a couple of cups of strong coffee soon cleared her brain from the mists of the drug. Barnes had been summoned by Holmes, and the situation rapidly explained to him.
"Why, sir, you've got me the very evidence I want,"
said the inspector, warmly shaking my friend by the hand.
"I was on the same scent as you from the first. What, you were after Henderson?"
"Why, Mr. Holmes, when you were crawling through the shrubbery at Highgable, I was up in the trees in the plantations and saw you down below. It was just who got this evidence first."
"And why did you arrest the mulatto?"
Baines chuckled.
"Usher Henderson, he calls himself, felt that he was suspected, and that he lie low and make no move so long as he thought he was in any danger. I arrested the wrong man to make him believe that our eyes were off him. I knew he would be likely to clear off and give us a chance at getting Miss Burnett."
Holmes laid his hand upon the inspector's shoulder.
"You will rise high in your profession. You have instinct and intuition," he said.
Baines flushed with pleasure.
"I've had a plainsman clothes waiting at the station all week. Whenever High Gable folk go, he will keep them in sight. But it must have been hard put to it when he saw Miss Burnett broke away. However, your man picked her up, and it was all ends well. We can't arrest her evidence is clear, so the sooner we get a statement, the better.
Every minute she gets stronger, said Holmes, glancing at the governess. But tell me, Baines, who is this man Henderson?
Henderson, the inspector agreed, is Don Murillo, once called the Tiger of San Pedro. The Tiger of San Pedro. The whole history of the man came to me in a flash. He had made his name as the most lewd and bloodthirsty tyrant that had ever governed the country with a presence of civilization. Strong, fearless, and energetic, he had sufficient virtue to enable him to impose his odious vices upon cowering people for 10 to 12 years. His name was terror through Central America. At the end of that time, there was a universal rising against him, but he was as cunning as he was cruel. And at the first whisper of coming trouble, he was secretly conveyed his treasures aboard the ship, which was manned by devoted adherents. It was an empty palace which was stormed by the insurgents next day. The dictator, his 2 children, his secretary, and his wealth had all escaped him. From that moment he had vanished from the world, so his identity had been a frequent subject of the comments of the European press. Yes, sir, Don Murillo, the Tiger of San Pedro, said Baines. If you look it up, you will find that San Pedro colors are green and white, same as on the note, Mr. Holmes. Henderson called himself, but I traced him back, Paris and Rome and Madrid to Barcelona, where a ship came in '86. They've been looking for him all the time out for their revenge, and it's only now that they've begun to find him out.
I discovered him 10 years ago,
said Miss Burnett, who had sat up and was now intently following the conversation.
Once already his life had been attempted, and some evil spirit shielded him. But again, now it is his noble, chivalrous Garcia who has fallen, while the monster goes safe. But another will come, and yet another, until some day justice will be done. That is as certain as the rise of tomorrow's sun.
Her thin hands clenched, and her worn face blanched with passion and hatred. But how come you into this matter, Miss Burnett? Said Holmes. How can an English lady join such a murderous affair?
I join in it because there is no other way in the world by which justice is gained. What does the law of England care about the rivers of blood shed years ago in San Pedro, or for the shipload of treasure which this man has stolen? To you they are like crimes committed on another planet, but we know. We have learned the truth in sorrow and suffering. Thus there is no fiend in hell like Juan Murillo, and no peace in life while his victims still cry out for justice.
No doubt, said Holmes. He was as you say. I have heard that he was atrocious, but how are you affected?
I will tell you it all. The villain's policy was to murder, on one pretext or another, every man who showed such promise that he might have come in time to be a dangerous rival. My husband, yes, my real name is Signor Victor Durando, was a San Pedro minister in London. He met me and married me there. A nobler man never lived upon earth. Unhappily, Murillo learned of his existence, recalled him on some pretext, and had shot him. With a premonition of his fate, he had refused to take me with him. His estates were confiscated, and I was left a pittance with a broken heart. Then came the downfall of the tyrant. He escaped as you have just described, but with the many whose lives he had ruined, whose nearest and dearest had suffered torture and death at his hands, who would not let the matter rest. They banded themselves into a society which should never be dissolved until the work was done. It was my part, after we discovered the transformation Hudson of the fallen despot, to attach myself to his household and keep the others in touch of his movements. This I was able to do by securing the position of governess for his family. He little knew that the woman who faced him every meal was the woman whose husband he had hurried at an hour's notice to eternity. I smiled at him, did my duty to his children, and bided my time. An attempt was made in Paris and failed. We zigzagged swiftly here over there, Europe to throw off the pursuers, and finally returned to this house, which he had taken upon his first arrival in England. But there were also ministers of justice were waiting. Knowing that he would return there, Garcia, who was the son of a former highest dignitary in San Pedro, was waiting with 2 rusty companions of humble station. All 3 fired at the same reasons for revenge. We could do little during the day, for Murillo took every precaution, and never went out save for those satellite Lucas, or Lopez as he was known in the days of his greatness. At night, however, he slept alone, and the Avenger might find him. On a certain evening which had been prearranged, I sent my friend the final instructions, for the man was forever on the alert and continually changed his room. I was to see that the doors were open, and the signal of green and white was in the window which faced the drive to give notice that it was safe, or if the attempt had better been postponed. But everything went wrong with us. In some way I had excited the suspicion of Lopez, his secretary. He crept up behind me and sprang upon me just as I had finished the note. He and his master dragged me from my room and held judgment upon me as a convicted traitress. Then and there they would have plunged their knives into me, could they have seen how I would escape the consequence of the deed. Finally, after much debate, they concluded that my murder was too dangerous, but they determined to get rid of forever of Garcia. Then they gagged me, and the Murillo twisted my arm around until I gave him the address. I swear that he might have twisted it off if I understood what it would mean to Garcia. Lopez addressed the note which I had given, sealed it with sleeve ink, and sent it by the hand of the servant Jose. How they murdered him I do not know, save for that it was Murillo's hand that struck him down, for Lopez had remained to guard me. I believe he must have waited among the gorse bushes through which the path winds and struck him down as he passed. At first, they were of the mind to let him enter the house and kill him as a detected burglar, but they argued if it would be mixed up in the inquiry of their own identity, which would be publicly disclosed if they would be open to further attacks. With the death of Garcia, the pursuit might cease, since the death might frighten others from the task. All would now have been well for them had it not been for my knowledge of what they had done. I have no doubt that there were times when my life hung in the balance. I was confined to my room, terrorized by the most horrible threats, cruelly ill-used to break my spirit. See the stab on my shoulder and the bruises from end to end on my arms? And a gag was thrust in my mouth on the one occasion I tried to call out the window. For 5 days this cruel imprisonment continued, with hardly enough food to hold body and soul together. This afternoon I had a good lunch and was brought to me, but the moment after it I knew I had been drugged. In some sort of dream I remember being half tied, half carried to the carriage. In the same state I was conveyed to the train. Only then, when the wheels were almost moving, did I realize that my liberty lay in my own hands. I sprang out, and they tried to drag me back, and had it not been for the help of this good man who led me to the cab, I should have never broken away. Now, thank God, I am beyond their powers forever.
We had all listened intently to this remarkable statement. It was Holmes who broke the silence. Our difficulties are not over, he remarked, shaking his head. Our police work ends, but our legal work begins. Exactly, said I. A plausible lawyer could make out an act of self-defense. There may be 100 crimes in the background, but it is only this one that needs to be tried. Come, said Baines. Surely, I think better of the law than that. Self-defense is one thing. To entice a man in cold blood to the object of murdering him is another. Whatever danger you may fear from, no, we shall not all be justified when we see the tenants of Highgable at the next Guilford Assizes. It was a matter of history, however, that little time was still to elapse before the Tiger of San Pedro should meet with his deserts. Wily and bold, he and his companion threw their pursuer off their tracks by entering a lodging-house in Edmonton Street, and leaving by the back gate of Curzon Square. From that day they were seen no more in England. Some 6 months afterwards, the Marquis of Montavia and Signor Rulli and his secretary were both murdered in their rooms in the Hotel Escurial at Madrid. The crime was ascribed to nihilism, and the murderers were never arrested. Inspector Baines visited us at Baker Street with a printed description of the dark face of the secretary and of the masterful features of magnetic black eyes and the tufted brows of his master. We could not doubt the justice, if belated, had come at last. A chaotic case, my dear Watson, said Holmes over an evening pipe. It is not possible for you to present it in the compact form in which your dear is to your heart.
It covers 2 continents, concerns 2 groups of mysterious persons, and is further complicated by the highly respectable presence of our friend Scott Eccles, whose inclusion shows me that the deceased Garcia had a scheming mind and a well-developed instinct for self-preservation. It is remarkable only for the fact that amid the perfect jungle of possibilities, we, with our worthy collaborator Inspector, have kept our close hold on the essentials and so been guided along the crooked and winding path. Is there any point which is not quite clear to you?
The object of the mulatto's cook's return.
I think that the strange creature in the kitchen may account for it. The man was a primitive savage from the backwoods of San Pedro, and this was his fetish. When his companion and he had fled to some prearranged retreat, already occupied, no doubt, with a Confederate, the companion had persuaded them to leave no compromising evidence as an article of furniture. But the mulatto's heart was with it, and was driven back to it the next day, when, reconnoitring through the window, he found the policeman Walters in possession. He waited 3 days longer, and then his piety and his superstition drove him to try once more. Inspector Baines, who, with his usual astuteness, had minimalized the incident before me, had really recognized its importance, and had left the trap into which the creature walked. On any other point, Watson?
The torn bird, the pail of blood, the charred bones, all the mystery of that weird kitchen. Holmes smiled as he turned up his entry in his notebook.
I spent the morning in the British Museum reading up on the other points. Here is a quotation from Eckermann's Voodooism and the Negroid Religions. The true voodoo worshipper attempts nothing of importance without certain sacrifices which are intended to propitiate his unclean gods. In the extreme cases, these rites take the form of human sacrifices followed by cannibalism. The more usual victims are a white cock, which is plucked to pieces alive, or a black goat whose throat is cut and body burned. You see, our savage friend was very orthodox in his ritual. It is grotesque, Watson, said Holmes as he slowly fastened his notebook. But as I have had on occasion to remark, there is but one step from the grotesque to the horrible.